Okay, I think we can start. I think we have about 33 participants and more coming in, but I think it's almost 3:09, 3:10. So namaste and hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today's session. My name is Lorena, and I'm the co-founder of a Kathmandu-based social enterprise called Ajis that empowers the elders to live happy and healthy life. And I will be moderating today's session. Let me welcome you once again to today's this special event about pursuing impact as a career for professionals and graduates, a very important and much needed topic. Before I introduce our speaker for today, let me just start with few house rules. We are all professionals here, and just to review the house rules, first would be I request you all to rename yourselves. Rename in the sense like put your full name as much as possible. We would like to know who you are, and if you'd also like to put your organization or enterprise name, you can do that as well. And the second would be kindly request you all to mute yourselves. We will have a discussion session after the presentation, and we will also have our chat open for questions towards the discussion. But if you have any questions or want to put any comments, you can raise your hand. There's a button to raise your hand in the reactions, I think. So, and we will let you in to ask your questions. Okay. Am I clear, loud and clear? Is my voice clear? If anyone could give me a thumbs up or. Yeah.
It's clear.
Okay, that's great because I know we're now, although we've been using the virtual world for many months now, it's always quite weird. It feels like you're talking to yourself. But okay, let me introduce today's special guest. For today's session, we have Professor Jasjit Singh. Professor Jasjit is a professor of strategy, the Paul de Breuil Chaired Professor of Sustainable Development. Professor Jasjit has been an INSEAD professor since 2004. His expertise includes strategy, innovation, sustainable development, purpose-driven business, impact investing, and impact evaluations. He regularly speaks on these topics and also advises entrepreneurs, philanthropists, investors, and organizations on how to best manage their societal impact. Professor Jasjit has written numerous articles for leading journals and case studies that have won prestigious awards. He earned a PhD in business economics at Harvard Business School and a master's in economics at Harvard University, having earlier obtained a bachelor's in technology in computer science and engineering at IIT Delhi and a double MS at Georgia Tech. And I had the privilege of meeting Professor Jasjit and learning from him during the social entrepreneurship course at INSEAD Business School in Singapore last year. And I must say it was a wonderful experience learning from him and just sharing the ideas and discussing the social entrepreneurship ideas with Professor Jasjit. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Jasjit for today's topic on pursuing impact careers. Professor Jasjit, welcome. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Lorena, for your very kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to you as well as Nanda, who's working behind the scenes along with his team to organize this event. Nanda is another of our star graduates from the INSEAD Social Entrepreneurship Program. So always a pleasure when ISEP alumni reach out, and happy to share some of my thoughts. And so what I'm going to talk about today, the topic for the day is pursuing impact careers. And a lot of the thoughts that I'm sharing today, they appear in some form or the other in some of the articles that you will find on my INSEAD website if you take a look. And there's also, the material that I cover in my courses. One of them, as Lorena mentioned, is the INSEAD Social Entrepreneurship Program. Another course that I teach both in our MBA and our EMBA program is called Strategy and Investing for Impact. But I'm going to focus squarely on some of the core themes from this material because we have limited time, of course. And I'm going to focus in particular on the quest for impact. You know, a lot of us, I assume people that are connecting today are people who are interested in having an impact. And this is becoming a very mainstream conversation, even in the business world. So that's something that I would like to talk about. And so the starting point, of course, is a conversation that very often comes up, right? So our society is a society dominated by conversation about, hey, you know, what university did you go to, where do you work, and how much money do you make? But in that context, one of the things that I've always been amazed is over the years, more and more people, even the ones with extremely successful careers after having done MBAs from places like INSEAD, come back and then say, okay, I've been working hard for hours and hours. I have achieved great titles. I have made a lot of money. And yet, is this really what I want? And invariably the conversation ends up being that there has to be more to life than just climbing up the ladders that we think are the conventional ladders and just making money. And in particular, one of the things that always comes up is this notion of are we thinking enough about society at large? And this is a conversation that we are seeing even more dominantly come up in the context of COVID this year, when we are seeing the kind of effect it's having on communities. This picture is of migrants in India. So obviously, on the one hand, we say, hey, you know, this is, we are in this together. But the reality is, yes, we are in the same storm, but we are not quite in the same boat. And some people are being affected far more than others, which reminds us that we live in a world where inequality continues to be a big issue. And if anything, has become an even bigger issue over time, even though extreme poverty is on the decline. And then the other conversation that invariably comes up is, you know, something like COVID today seems like the dominant thing because it's crisis, but in the bigger scheme, something like the upcoming, you know, economic crisis that's going to follow for years, perhaps, and more broadly, even bigger issues like climate change. There's a lot more action that needs to be done. And so in the light of these bigger conversations, there's a lot of people saying, how do I contribute to society? And so very often, then the question then at the individual level is, how do I lead a meaningful life? And one of the things, as we know, whether we talk to philosophers, whether we talk to spiritual leaders, whether we talk to political leaders, is that happiness really requires us to have a consistency in our life that normally is sometimes missing. Can I request people to mute their mic? I hear noise from somebody's mic there. So very often, uh, Praveen, I think your mic is on.
Ravinji.
Yeah, thank you. So of course, you know, a lot of us do things like volunteering during weekends, during evenings, engaging in corporate social responsibility projects, and so on. And here's an example of one of the projects I went with some INSEAD colleagues on painting one of the special needs schools, special needs children's school in Singapore. And you know, this, you can see that engaging in activities like this very often is a great opportunity for people to come together to talk about societal issues and all of that. But if you really put it in perspective, you know, we are probably not making the most difference to the world by putting in a professor in the job of a painter, with the next day a real painter having to come in and clean up all the mess that I created for them. So the question really becomes, how do we contribute in a way that's in line with our strengths? And that's a point I'm going to come back to. But the broader conversation then is, what really is impact, right, in the first place? And very often these conversations become very convoluted, but I like to start with this very simple definition of impact, which is, imagine that, you know, there's a society in which you're not there, versus now you show up in the society and you do all the things that you do. But practically, what changes, right? That becomes the question. And how much does the society change for the better because of you? That really would be, if you remove all the details, the definition of what is your impact, which is what do you achieve. It's not about your best intentions, but it's about what do you ultimately achieve in improving outcomes for society. The other thing that's very important to recognize, going back to the example of me going to, paint a house in a nonprofit or a charity, is that invariably we end up thinking of these as two different conversations: the conversation about impact and the conversation about running a business. But very often, the real opportunity to make the biggest possible difference lies at the intersection of the two, especially for people, the kind of people that I teach, like business school students or business leaders who come back to INSEAD programs. It's always useful to ask not what you do just in the evenings and the weekends as your marginal projects, but what do you do in your everyday job, and how does that affect society? Because the reality is all of us are already having an impact, even if you're not measuring it. And sometimes, honestly, the impact might even be negative rather than positive. So the question to ask is, by getting more deliberate about impact, can we do better than where we are, right? So in this overlap, I'm going to quickly take three short examples. The first I'm going to talk about is an organization called Proximity Designs in Myanmar, which works with farmers in Myanmar, right? Now, primarily, the organization is set up with a view of impact, not for making money, but it still is set up as a business, because there's a very deliberate choice being made that if you present farmers with products and services, and in particular, they started with really low cost irrigation pumps, design using the most advanced design thinking techniques, but bringing it to the simplest product at the lowest possible price point, but with a view that this is going to significantly improve the farmer's productivity. So the prices are naturally kept low. They go out of their way to seek out farmers that if you were a for-profit company, those would not be a target farmer, right? You would go after bigger farmers that have more money. You would sell them a higher margins product. So you're still selling them rather than giving them, because you believe this gives them a sense of choice, a sense of dignity, and it engages them in a way that you wouldn't engage them if you were just doing charity, right? So that's sort of the mindset of a social enterprise, which is I'm going to think of business just as a tool, not necessarily for maximizing the money I make, but for improving the impact I can make, because now I don't need to go back to the donors every year and depend on them. And at the same time, I can keep my enterprise running for many, many years rather than depending on the cycles of the donor funding. At the same time, yes, partially I might depend on donors. And for example, for funding my R&D to come up with the next generation of products, or to subsidize training in my organization and so on. So this is the social enterprise model. Then there is what I call an impact business model, where you're actually aspiring to build a business which really will be profitable, which ultimately the hope is you will even be able to get mainstream investors. So this is the example of another ISEP alum from India who built this impact business called Life Circle, which is still relatively in the early years, but it has expanded to several cities in India, which is about providing care to elderly people in their homes. But it's a business model, which is there's a demand for it. They charge people, and but they're very sensitive to the impact they're having, both on the elders as well as the family at large. For example, very often it would be the woman in the house who's not able to pursue a career because she's taking care of the elderly. But for a few hours a day, if she gets help, then she's able to do other things with her time and follow other passions or other career choices that she might have. So again, impact, but through a lens of, at the same time, you're building a business rather than doing it as a charity. And then the third thing I want to point out is this idea of sustainable business, which is more and more of even the mainstream businesses like Apple today are talking about not just making money, but also being sensitive to societal needs. Because in the long term, they're seeing there actually being a business case for that, which is if you're living in a society where you're not viewed positively by your stakeholders, you're not going to be able to survive in the long term. Of course, the challenge in large companies like Apple trying to push their social agenda too hard is that there will always be at least a segment of investors who are going to push back, right? So there's limits on how much you can do. So you're trying to align a long-term business agenda with a long-term impact agenda, but there will always be room for organizations that are able to bring mission more middle and center, because they don't have that pressure from the shareholders. So the way I like to see these different kind of businesses is I like to think of this as a spectrum, right? So it's not just one kind of business. There's a room for different kinds of businesses who are contributing to society in different ways. It can be social enterprises, it can be impact businesses, and it can be sustainable businesses. And of course, there will always be room for charities and pure NGOs, because there are certain problems in which you just can't make a viable business model if you're serving, let's say humanitarian causes, right? Like there was an earthquake in Nepal a few years ago. You need organizations like Red Cross to come in and provide the aid. But the point is to push yourselves and ask, when do we need the aid? And when we really need the aid, of course, we rely on the charity or aid model. But when is it that it's useful to start to transition away from that and build business models, but business models that are being designed not just keeping in mind making money, but also keeping in mind how you're positively contributing to society. And yes, there will perhaps be a room still for some traditional businesses which are purely relying on the market mechanism to create value. And there's always a room for that as well. But very often there are externalities, there are outcomes like inequality for which it's helpful for business to have this deliberate notion of impact. So the spectrum is not about one kind of organization being better than the other, but these are all tools on how to try to have an impact on society. And so just to clarify this point a little bit, which is, it's an important distinction to say what is your intention for having impact and what's the actual impact you're having. And I like to give the example of this research study that was done many years ago in the UK, where there were a bunch of paragliding centers who were raising money for charitable causes and in the process getting new clients to sign up for paragliding. The challenge was, they thought they were having an impact by raising money, right? So, but in the bigger scheme of things, they were also imposing some costs. And specifically, what the study showed was they had 1,500 people over a certain number of years who took up the opportunity. They raised 120,000 pounds in the UK. Now, a substantial part of that went back to paying for the cost of jumping out of planes. It's an expensive sport. Even so, you might think, hey, there is still the impact, isn't there? Well, the real challenge was a lot of these people actually were first-time jumpers. The procedures were not adequate, the safety procedures and training and all of that. And it ended up being the case that 163, which is more than 10% of the people, got injured, some of them pretty seriously, even needing hospitalization, to a point where the UK health system ended up picking a cost of 610,000 pounds. So basically, for every $1,000 that was raised, more than $10,000 or pounds went into a cost associated with the project. So if you even think these numbers are close to a reality, you would still come to a conclusion that on the whole, despite the good intentions of the project, it is not clear that this was a project that was good for society. And this highlights the point that it's not just about what you're doing. It's not just about how much you're spending or what your intentions are or the kind of activities you're carrying out. It's ultimately about what are the outcomes, what's the cost effectiveness of achieving those outcomes, And are you ending up having unintended consequences in the process of trying to have an impact? So long story short, the point here is to say that good intentions are real impact are related things, but they're not the same thing. So on the one hand, the picture on the left, people being very excited and passionate about making a positive difference to the world. It's a great thing, but it's just a start. It's very important. Just like in business, we are very careful to see whatever we are doing, how is it going to make money? Similarly, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, it's worthwhile to be level-headed and see, yes, I am all excited and I want to do that out of this passion that I have, but am I really achieving what I ultimately stand for in terms of my mission, right? So one of the questions then obviously that comes up is whenever you're saying, okay, am I achieving something, is that's a question about evaluating impact. And this is a picture of, I volunteered for a year at a nonprofit that does training for domestic helpers in Singapore, because Singapore has a big immigrant domestic helper community. And the idea was we would provide them training on Sundays, which is their day off, and that when they go back to their home countries later, this training can help them restart a new career, maybe start a small business and all of that, right? Again, so it's our best intentions, but the key question is, are we delivering our content in a way that's relevant for them, in a way that they can absorb, in a way that will actually help them when they go back? And we can't just take that as a given. If our outcome is to really ensure their livelihoods back when they go in their respective home countries, the burden is a little bit on us to make sure it's actually happening, rather than this being, again, one of our vanity projects where we think we're helping them. At the moment, we all feel happy, but it doesn't really lead to a meaningful outcomes, right? So when we're talking about impact, then we have to talk about how are we actually making a difference. Now, most people, when they have conversations around impact, they get very focused on how many lives are we touching. So there's always this pressure, hey, 1,000 is better than 100 and 10,000 is better than 1,000. And if I could touch 1,000,000 lives, that's great. I think all else being equal, that is correct and meaningful, but we should not forget that the so-called scale of impact or the breadth of impact is only one of the dimensions of impact. The other dimension, very important, is depth of impact, which is how much difference are we actually making in the lives of each of the person that we're working with in terms of helping them achieve outcomes that are really important to them for their lives being better. And then the third dimension that obviously comes in our discussion in the context of business versus non-business approaches is how long is this impact going to last? Which is, if I have $1 million today and I can spend it on feeding poor people through one of those free community kitchens, yes, at some level, it looks like a great thing that I did, but then the million is finished. Versus if I use that million to build a social enterprise or an impact business, that ultimately is going to sustain itself for years to come. So it's a source of livelihood for these people, not just for today, but for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. So the impact in a way multiplies if the business model does work out and the business model really is focused not just on making money, but also on having impact, right? So important to bear in mind, impact is a complex thing. It's a multidimensional thing. At a minimum, you need to think both the scale, the depth, and then combine that with is this a trigger, or is this something that we would need every year to go back for more funding, right? So just moving on from there, then the summary so far is it's great to start with a passion, but it's important to combine that passion with the examination of three other factors, which is a passion is great, but do you really have strengths to deliver on that passion? What really are the important societal needs? And by the way, to the extent that I'm going to sustain myself or my organization needs to sustain ourselves for another 10 years, are some of these needs such that we can actually form perhaps a business model around that? So there's a Japanese concept that has become very popular in recent years. It's called ikigai, which is saying, if you're looking for a career that's focused on impact, it's of course very useful to start with what your passions are, but just starting with this motto of follow your passion, it's a little bit incomplete, which is if your passion is something which is not aligned with your strengths, is not aligned with the societal need, then it's not clear you would have a meaningful impact. I mean, the only exception to this is paying opportunities. If you think, you have another job or you have enough savings and that's not a critical factor for you, then perhaps you can just look for overlap between the other three things. But that looks like a bare minimum, which is aligning a passion that's going to sustain you through the journey with some real societal need that is normally neglected and underserved, and then combining it with your unique contribution that you bring to the table as you try to meet that need. So the interesting thing is, very often, a lot of times I've seen people, when they talk about social impact, they think of this as completely different from what an entrepreneur would do. But in reality, if you are running an impact initiative in a company, or if you're a social entrepreneur, a lot of the questions that you ask are similar to what an entrepreneur would ask. And here's an example of an article that recently was written by this wonderful INSEAD alum whose name is Utkarsh Amitabh. And he's asking the question in this article, how do you know you're ready to give up your regular job, which you might not be as excited about, and follow your passion project as a full-time thing? And he suggests these 4 things, which I've slightly reworded, which is, the first thing is you have to be pretty sure that this is not your hubris, but it's a real problem for a well-defined customer you've identified. The second is you have the skills and resources you require to quit and actually run this as a business. The third is, you have to have some evidence that the solution is actually working. And the fourth, which connects to the third, is there evidence you're already starting to attract enough paying customers? I think the big difference between the social entrepreneur and the entrepreneur very often is the fourth point, which is, I think the first 3 still have to hold. The challenge in the fourth very often is sometimes social entrepreneurs have a model in which the full cost of the solution is not borne by the people you're trying to serve, right? In which case you might have this illusion of reaching out to a lot of people, but if you're giving something for free, it could be a lot of people are taking up your offering, but it is still not meaningfully changing their lives, right? So it goes back to then asking, okay, if I can no longer use a customer's willingness to pay as evidence that I'm creating value, how do I know I really am achieving the meaningful depth of impact that I wanted to have? And for that, you have to do this extra work if you're a social entrepreneur that perhaps an entrepreneur relying purely on market channels would not, which is asking these questions, which, and I'm going to here follow the framework that the impact management project follows in asking about impact of a project. What outcomes are we seeking? For example, if you're a microfinance organization, as is the case in this picture from Myanmar that I took, this is one of the microfinance clients. What outcomes am I seeking in her life when I look for impact? For example, am I supporting her business? Do I want her to be a successful entrepreneur? So the second question will be who, which is what is my target segment? Who are these women? How much money are they already making? What options do they already have? If I'm the 5th person providing loan to them versus I really am the first source of funding from them, it's a big difference. The third question to ask is how much am I improving the outcomes, or how much are the outcomes improving? But the fourth question is about contribution, which is how much are they improving because of my efforts, right? That's a tough question to ask because there might be other things happening in their lives. The environment might be improving. Maybe there's economic growth happening in Myanmar. Maybe there's a government program also in that village. So how do I know it's my contribution? And there are ways to study that. And that's all about impact evaluation that some of you might be familiar with. And then the last question to ask is, what are the risks? What are the risks I will not achieve what I'm trying to achieve? And what are the risks that I might even make things worse? For example, what happened with microfinance in 2010 in India, with a lot of farmers even committing suicide in Andhra Pradesh because a lot of the loans were sold very aggressively. And then when it was time to repay, they were being bullied to a point where, some farmers even took their lives because they couldn't deal with that situation. So those kind of things obviously have to be avoided as well. So, sometimes when you talk about impact evaluation, it's useful to put down what in the development space is called a theory of change. I like to call it an impact model, saying, just to summarize some of the things we've talked about, starting with a real problem, being very clear how the resources that you're putting in and the activities you're carrying out is translating not just into number of people showing up, which is the outputs, but actual outcomes and changes in outcomes in their lives, while making sure that you really are on the net having positive impacts without imposing additional costs. So it's a big hurdle to think through that, but that's why, done right, this space is hard. And it requires a degree of resilience and motivation to sustain yourself in this space, because you're still doing everything that an entrepreneur would do. But then you're asking these additional questions that perhaps not all entrepreneurs would ask. So just to, in the next 2-3 minutes, finish up this conversation, a few things to bear in mind, which is we might see the lens from a narrow point of view, and sometimes we are working as if on the near the tip of the iceberg, but we have to bear in mind also what are the broader underlying societal issues that are manifesting themselves in the form of specific problems we're trying to solve. And somebody has to be working at the systems level. And that's why it's increasingly people are saying social entrepreneurs should not view themselves as sort of individual heroes, but you really have to form yourselves as a part of a collaborative impact ecosystem where you're trying to contribute to a bigger picture that you're trying to collectively work towards in society. The other thing that I would say is that issues of economic development or social impact are sometimes separated from issues of environmental impact. But in the end, as a society, we need to think about both, because just to take this framework from Kate Raworth, she uses the metaphor of a donut, saying, think of a donut, the inner boundary of it is sort of the minimum social sort of foundation that the society needs, just to make sure everybody has their basic needs met and the basic human dignity of life, while respecting the outer boundary, which is the ecological ceiling of the planet. Because yes, we want to have economic development in places like India and Nepal. At the same time, we as a global community have to bear in mind that it cannot be with the same models that have been used in the West, because that's going to violate the ecological ceiling. And we can't deal with the environmental issues if we are not sensitive to these issues already in the way we are dealing with social issues in tackling the poorer communities around the world. And the last thing I want to say, and this is something that I particularly emphasize with people who come from privileged backgrounds in the bigger scheme of things, such as MBA students, such as business people, to be honest, such as business school professors like myself, which is it's very important to approach this space with humility. And from a point of view that impact ultimately is not you doing a favor to somebody else. To me, impact, or you striving for impact, is a matter of you trying to do your best to contribute to a world that's just fair. Because a lot of us are privileged. We were born in well-to-do families. We were born with parents who were loving and caring. We were born in parents that are well educated. We went to good schools. So a lot of times we end up thinking, hey, I'm so successful in life because I'm so smart and I deserve all of this money, all of this fame, all of these medals I'm getting. But the reality is, no individual is an island. And in the end, we have to think of the common good, to use the word that Michael Sandel uses, on contributing back with a mindset of not, helping others or doing anybody a favor, but just doing the right thing, which is we have been privileged and we are where we are. Yes, partly in part because of our ability and hard work, but partly because we were fortunate and lucky in a way that many others weren't. So it's just the right thing to do. So I'll stop here. And before we take questions, one of the things Lorena and I were discussing was, I'm just curious to get Lorena's reactions from her own work as a social entrepreneur in Nepal, who set up this wonderful social enterprise called Ajis, which is still in the early years. So I think it's still relatively small, but I think has a huge potential. And so I'd love to hear, just to make it relevant also for the Nepalese audience a little bit more. How would all the things that I've talked about, you think, connect to what you're seeing in Nepal in general, or your own work with Ajis? And after that, we can have some questions.
Thank you, Professor Jasjit. Let me just introduce Ajis a little bit for those who may not know about Ajis. So Ajis is a social enterprise, Kathmandu-based social enterprise that focuses on empowering elders to live happy and healthy lives. So we basically focus on three things. First is to promote the products that they make using their unique skills and knowledge. So we market those products. And second is to organize different workshops, different skill transfer workshops and other dialogues between across generations to build strengthen those bond between generations. The third one is we preserve the legacy, the stories, the experiences of the elders for the younger generation to learn from and to seek inspiration from in the form of podcasts, in the form of blog and many other videos. Okay? So like Professor Jasjit rightly shared, Ajis is also a small social enterprise right now. And we're also sort of struggling and also thinking about how to scale up. And we also had this conversation before, that how Ajis can scale up, or what is our thinking around that. But I was also sharing with Professor Jasjit that social enterprises like Ajis, we're more focused on the mission and not so much on the profit and the income and the customers, although that is a very important part of the entire equation. But definitely our focus are our makers and our elders that we work with as guests, as makers, as instructors. So we're taking it slow in that whole spectrum.
Thank you for sharing that, Lorena. And any reactions in general on the discussions that we had about what you're seeing in Nepal? And after that, we can take some questions from people.
Right. I think for Nepal, the whole social enterprise or the startup of enterprise is still in a very young stage, right? So there's a lot when we compare to Singapore, let's say, or when we compare to San Francisco, let's say, right? The Silicon Valley, where all these ecosystems are very strong and all. In terms of Nepal, it's very early stage, and there are not many players in the ecosystem to support social enterprises and social entrepreneurs, especially the startup ones. And just the concept of social entrepreneurship versus the traditional entrepreneurship is also quite still in the initial stage, I would say. There's a lot that needs to be understood and clarified. So it's, and also the government, I think there's a lot that needs to change for me as a social entrepreneurship myself. The provisions and the policies that the government has put forth for enterprises in general is very blanket approach, right? So it doesn't even recognize startups, let alone social enterprises, right? So that's a struggle for small social enterprises like Ajis. They're looking to scale up slowly, right? So that requires a lot of support from other players in the ecosystem, especially from the government. And the real impact investors. I think I'll put a question to you later on if we don't have, like, we'd say there's a lack of, or let's say the concept of the real impact investing is still quite questionable in the Nepali social entrepreneurship ecosystem. So that's another thing. Okay. So I think we will move to the question answer question answer session now. And I request Neerajji to open the chat box so that anyone who's interested can put your question in the chat box or just raise your hand if you would like to speak. Let's see if we
Yes,
have.
I've already opened the chat box.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions so far?
None so far.
Okay, I think this is a very interesting event session, and I think I'd request all the participants to take this as much as possible, make the best use of this session and the best use of Professor Jasjit's knowledge and experiences. I think we do have a question here from Praveen Tiwari. He says, measuring impact is really challenging. What are the tools to measuring impact? Professor Jasjit, would you like to take question one by one, or do you want to put it all together?
Sure. So we can talk a little bit about measuring impact, because this is obviously a very important topic that very often comes up. The important thing I should start with is, which builds on some of the things that I said earlier, that sometimes people are looking for that one magic bullet, one single number on impact. And in fact, there are even efforts going on to translate impact into dollar terms and so on. But I think it's still early in my view to be that ambitious. It's more about being very clear. So most people in the space that are, when they're approaching impact measurement, they're asking a question. Let's first be clear, what are we trying to achieve, right? Because if you don't ask that question, but directly get to impact. So it's very fashionable to say, hey, we reached 1,000 farmers and we also have diversity in our board. And at the same time, this is our carbon footprint and all of that. And I think that's all about sort of running a decent organization and keeping track of a wide range of what are called the ESG metrics, or environmental, social, and governance metrics. But if you really are starting with an impact or a mission, then it's first and most importantly, the question to ask is, who are you trying to serve and what outcomes are you trying to achieve? And everything then follows from that. On all measurement has to be around, are we really reaching the people that we wanted to serve? And then are we changing their lives in a way that we sought to? Now, some of these are approached with a very rigorous approach, especially in larger projects in the development space. There might be organizations like JPAL running randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard of sort of statistical analysis on some of these. But then practically, there's a lot of techniques that have come up in recent years. One that comes to mind is Acumen in India has this thing called the Lean Data Initiative, which was then spun off as a separate organization, which is all about using quick technology, survey-based approaches to figure out exactly who are you reaching through your work and how are they responding. So it's a little bit of the same approach as people would do in the business world on seeking customer feedback. And it's this mindset that when we are doing impact evaluation, to a large extent, it is about ultimately figuring out the people that we are serving, how are they perceiving it? So it's not our understanding of impact. Ultimately, it has to be from their point of view. Are you making a meaningful difference in their life? So that's the depth of impact, which is, obviously the trickier thing that a lot of these measurement efforts go into. The scale is an easier one to measure, which is simply seeing how many people are you're reaching. But even there, it's important to see who are you reaching, right? So if you're a hospital chain supposedly built up for the poor, you have to build in data systems to somehow capture, are the patients that are reaching access to healthcare to people who absolutely cannot afford it, then then hopefully you should be reaching at least a substantial chunk of that segment. Otherwise, what's the point, right? So.
Thank you, Professor. Now we have Kaushal Sapkota from King's College. He's raised his hand. Kaushalji, please go ahead and answer.
It's good to see you again. So my question is around this both paradox that goes on where as we move on more towards an entrepreneurial solution, people are kind of rejecting the advocacy related solutions, saying that everything has to be entrepreneurial and advocacy is an outdated concept. So my question to you is, culturally and professionally, what are some of the paradoxes that we need to think about when we think of a career in impact, and how can we go around that?
So, I mean, this is obviously in line with the conversation that we were having earlier, which is the first point to recognize is that these are just different tools, right? There is a room for charity. There's a base model, rate-based models, and very often advocacy might fit in there as if you're campaigning for government of India to work towards, that is a huge thing. So there's the opportunity for the entrepreneur who's trying to build products in more sustainable ways, is doing more recycling, promoting reuse of products, or the person who's going to be, in a way, the hub for ecosystem level efforts, right? In a way, that's what you're referring to. I don't think this, maybe this challenge is more in Asia, but it's not obvious to me, because this is a global challenge of normally seeing philanthropic activity or volunteering and so on as different from work. And I think very often it also comes from the fact that that's how the opportunities themselves are, right? If you're working in a large corporate, a lot of times we feel that there just isn't that much we can do within the system. And it's easy to sometimes get dejected. And I've seen both kinds of people, right? Some people say, I stifle in that organization and I'm just going to go build a charity. And one of the case studies I sometimes teach is John Wood, who started this large organization called Room to Read, which originally started in Nepal. So he was at Microsoft. He says, I'm done with this. I'm quitting. I'm going to do my own thing. But then there are other people who just say, okay, I recognize that if I'm a big organization, and the example that I sometimes give development partnerships within Accenture. Before that, Accenture used to have consulting projects primarily for corporate clients. And he says, why are we not offering our services to development clients, right? If there is supply chain management might be used for Coca-Cola or Procter and Gamble, but supply chain management is also valuable if cold chain and minus 70 degrees Celsius. If somebody is really good at supply chain management, that skill becomes immediately relevant for that issue as well. So I think once you start thinking from the point of view, what are we trying to achieve and what are my skills? Sometimes business itself might be a good vehicle. Sometimes it might be business people can take the same skills, and a lot of those skills still remain relevant. If you're building world-class social sector organizations, you still need the accountants, you still need the marketing people, you still need the communication people. Somehow there's this sense that now I'm doing social impact work. Well, a lot of impact work is actually pretty boring work because you're still doing the accounting and you're still making the spreadsheets. But that's how you're having more impact rather than having the romantic view of social impact world is giving food to the poor or building houses in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes you don't make as it's not obvious I've answered your question, but I think given some thoughts around that topic. And by the way, yeah, I'm happy to make the slides available through Lorena, and Lorena, you can, or Nanda, and you can post them on the website. You already have my slides. Feel free to post them.
Sure. Okay, let's maybe move on to next question. We have another question from Aniladri Pariyalji. He's the principal of Sri Yoga School, and his question is, how can we envision schools as center of community impact that fosters learners and teachers to take the lead?
I mean, it certainly can be one of the hubs, I guess. Maybe I'm distracting from the question, but this whole notion of humility in impact and actually taking it as a sense of our responsibility just as a decent human being and as a decent citizen rather than doing a favor to somebody else. I think a lot of that conversation has to start right from the education system, right? I think our education system has gotten too obsessed with congratulating the toppers in the class and considering everybody else a failure, and that's a gap then keeps on growing forever, versus actually being right from the beginning saying, okay, are we creating citizen lives for everyone in the society, versus are we considering a bunch of selfish people who for the rest of their lives will be just competing with each other and stepping on each other's toes, and every now and then say, hey, maybe I should do something for others and go, volunteer for half a day and then go back to being, I'm being a bit extreme here, I know, but I think it has to be a very culturally driven, ingrained thing right from the start, this sense of common good. And schools certainly sound like one of the possible opportunities, because I do believe education is very important for that. And we know in education that the earlier you start, the bigger the impact is. If you're educating college kids, yes, you would make some difference. But if somebody has been thinking like that since they were in grade 1, it's you're going to have a very different society.
Ladriji, I Professor Jasjit, that education is the key because, well, the education system in Nepal is changing gradually towards that. I think many schools and many education institutions are changing their style, the traditional style of learning, and hopefully we'll have more leaders, more towards thinking about common good. So let's see if we have more questions. We do have. So there's one from Prem Gairiji, who's the head of the BIC startups. He says, we're trying out different things that increase our impact by reducing the ecological sense. Doesn't it make sense to do less and less to actually achieve this end? Having a laid back lifestyle, living with lesser means, and so on. Very interesting.
Absolutely. This is, a big picture question. And so certainly in general, I mean, at a bare minimum, obsessed with consumption and growth that's not sustainable growth, right? So even the so-called green companies, sometimes what they do is they say, our clothes are completely recycled, so please buy them. But the real question is, if you're going to buy them and still buy everything you would have bought anyway, it's not going to help. It has to be about prioritizing, saying, well, we should be prioritizing these kind of products and not others. And another fantastic case study for me is this company called Patagonia in California, which is an absolute inspiration, which is during Thanksgiving sale, what they normally push very aggressively as a message is, and of course they're running a business, then they say, well, and if you really need to buy it, then buy our products because they're more sustainable. But the starting line at least is, do you really need a green colored jacket when you bought a blue colored jacket last year? If the purpose of the jacket is to keep you warm, you don't have to have the most fashionable jacket every 6 months. And very important only even if you can afford it, right? Because wouldn't you? Versus asking, well, the reason you wouldn't is still not good for the world. And this is where I think education is very important. And of course, the other thing that's important is policy in not letting companies get away with being bad for the environment, right? So the home delivery, some of the home delivery companies here in Singapore, they're terrible at the amount of packaging that they use. And part of the reason they are able to do that is they say, look, this packaging makes the customer happy and the government is not complaining, so we'll do it, right? So there is this, I think it has to work at both ends. The advocacy has to happen at the level of the customer and educating them that, yeah, it might be convenient to get bags with, lots of extra packaging and padding and all of that. But at the same time, you're damaging the environment, but you also have to work on the policy. It's either or. You have to work on both sides. And we absolutely need the activists that are going to keep us honest, because it's not like, yeah, the business people will do some things, but at the other end, if they feel pressures from the shareholders, they're going to raise their hand. So this is where I also see an amazing contribution from organizations like Greenpeace, which keep us honest.
A bit here. So when we think about products and our what we have to offer through our enterprises, it's not always necessarily the tangible products, right? Yes. So at Audis, we do have tangible products that our elders make based at home. But we also very much focus on the intangible products that are their experiences, their stories, their lifestyles, right? Their history, culture attached to it through podcasts, through videos that also hold a lot of messages, a lot of importance and experience, right? So we can also look at from the side of intangible products and associating with the intangible heritage.
Absolutely. And a lot of times, I mean, the big companies, going back to example of Patagonia, right? Patagonia's impact on the world is not through its own environmental sustainability efforts, because in the bigger scheme, it's small. But it comes from these guys really educate the world on, look, their website will literally say, look, we are still work in progress. They won't try to say they're perfect. They'll say, look, you have to be aware. This is what happens when we build products. So please don't consume. So they are very aggressively positioning themselves as an activist brand, which in part helps for their segment, but in part also educates the world at large about issues. So that's the intangible benefit, which I would say a company like Patagonia would have, is actually much bigger than just the tangible. Their products are just more sustainably made than others.
Exactly. So shall we move on to the next question, Professor Jasjit?
Maybe we can take one more question and then maybe we should wrap it up, because we don't want to keep people too late.
Okay, let's make this as the last question. Very interesting one here from Sandeep Shrestha. He says, what are your views on corporations that do not label themselves as impact or sustainable, but are solving the most pressing societal issues? On the contrary, your view on social enterprises that may be solving one societal problem, but might have overlooked other safeguard measures?
So, Sandeep, I think that's a great question. And I think it's in line with a comment that I'd made earlier, right? Which is there's a difference between intentionality for impact and that spectrum that I'd shown. That was about how much are you relying on the market mechanism versus non-market mechanism, which is a very deliberately seeking impact. But that's a spectrum on that count. That is not a spectrum about, therefore, one of them will have more impact than the others. Think back to Nokia in its early days, showing up in Africa and making low-cost mobile phones available to the farmers, which then went on to completely change their lives. But Nokia was not calling itself sustainable or impact organization. It was just running a normal business. And so that's the idea. Business in principle is not a fundamentally good or a bad thing. Business is just a tool, just like we talk about nuclear energy just being a tool, right? You can use it to generate sustainable energy, or you can use it to cause destruction. And certainly there's a lot of companies that wouldn't label themselves explicitly for impact, but they are producing products and services that we need in our everyday lives. And similarly, there's a lot of social enterprises. And this is where I mean this notion of humility, which is especially there are some social enterprises who are not very careful about the actual impact that they're having, but they like to tell stories that are just cool stories, just so that they look nice, but in reality, they might not be that good for the world, and they might even sometimes have negative effects that they are not even recognizing or aware of. And so that's why it's important not to sort of put social enterprises on the pedestal and businesses as bad things. We have to look more closely and see what is being achieved, not just what the story is being told, right? Just spinning the stories. And sometimes it's not being told from a position of being malicious. It's just that, you actually think that you're achieving something great by doing X. But once you really get into the nitty-gritty, once you start measuring what's happening on the ground, once you even think carefully about your strategy, you realize that maybe the impact is not that great. And for example, I might be creating a culture of dependence in this community by going there with a mindset of I'm here to help you, rather than making them feel that, okay, you know what, I do have some sense of agency. There's something I can do about my life. I do need support from others, but I don't need handouts from others.
Thank you, Professor. And I think with this last question, we will have come to the end of this session. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. It was very good, and your questions were very insightful. Thank you very much. And like Professor Jasjit said, we will be sharing the slides if you want. We have all your email addresses during your registration. And if you have any questions, you can always write to us at Aujis or at Skill Lab, and we can forward it to Professor Jasjit. And thank you very much, Professor Jasjit, for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. All the best in your future work. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And with this, I'd like to announce that we've come to the end of this session. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.